Welcome. My name is Emily Pinkowitz, and I'm the Interim Director of Public Programs, Education, and Community Engagement. And I'm so happy to welcome you to the third and final Beyond the Highline talk, Transforming Freshkills, Staten Island. So today's program features two really fabulous speakers. The first will be James Corner from James Corner Field Operations. Those of you who are Highline buffs are probably familiar with James Corner Field Operations. They were the major designers of this park, the primary designers of this park. And James is a registered landscape architect and an urban designer and the founder and director of James Corner Field Operations, where he oversees the production of all design projects in the office. And the lead designers of the Highline Park, James Corner Field Operations, is also leading the design of Freshkills Park in Staten Island. He actually got that contract before the Highline, but you can, as you'll see over the course of this presentation, Freshkills is a major project with a lot of moving pieces. He is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, where he was also chair for over a decade until this year. He was educated at Manchester Metropolitan University in England with a BA first class and at the University of Pennsylvania. And our second presenter will be Eloise Hirsh from the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. And Eloise Hirsh was appointed the administrator of Freshkills Park in 2006. And she recently returned from 18 years in Pittsburgh, where she had been the director of city planning, as well as leading projects on open space preservation, transportation, and public education. Prior to that, Eloise had spent 20 years in New York City government in a variety of positions, her favorite being first deputy commissioner at the Parks Department during the time of the founding of the Central Park Conservancy and the Prospect Park Alliance. And she's taught at Carnegie Mellon, the University of Pittsburgh, and NYU's Wagner School of Public Service. So I'm very excited to welcome both of them to talk about Freshkills landfill, which was once the largest landfill in the world. Did anybody here grew up in New York and are familiar with the old incarnation of Freshkills? So I don't know about you all, but when I first heard about this project, it sounded like the most magical thing on earth. And the more I learn about it, the more I feel that way. So they will talk about how they'll transform Freshkills Park into one of New York City's largest public parks. And I'll welcome James Corner. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to speak for about 15 minutes on Freshkills, and then Eloise will have 15 or 20 minutes to speak about what she's been up to in the past few years. We started this project in 2000, and in the 15 minutes that I have, it's really a little story about time. The Highline is a totally different context from Freshkills Park. Its timeline was quick. It's in a very urban context that's very built up. The sort of attention to design detail and the implementation of construction, in a sense, is a different mindset from the design mindset you bring to Freshkills. Freshkills has a number of challenges and a number of characteristics that make it a fascinating phenomenon, but you really have to understand it as something that is bound into time, and that the design approach is very different from the design approach here on the Highline. One of the problems, or one of the issues, at Freshkills is its location on the west side of Staten Island, and we call this a theater of process. There are an enormous number of government agencies and jurisdictions and a large number of stakeholders and community groups who all have very different agendas and very different interests with regards to this park. It presents a great challenge in terms of being able to be clear and being able to move quickly. Therefore, we find ourselves caught in a process, in the design of a process. The second thing is, it's a very, very big site. It's nearly 4 square miles, 2,200 acres, which is 3.5 times the size of Central Park. Now think about that. It's huge. It's also bisected by an expressway that you see running through the middle. It creates two sides to the park. And the park itself has some very beautiful creeks. You see the blue creeks that are running through it. It's extraordinarily beautiful, but it's also extraordinarily large. If you overlay that same site on Lower Manhattan, it would stretch from the Battery to 26th Street. It would be the width of the entire length of Houston Street. So this is a huge site in a very complicated political milieu, and it's something that will take time. This was an exhibition we had at the Museum of Modern Art that tried to communicate something about the size and the scale and the temporality of the park. The third issue, and probably the most challenging issue from the point of view of how to make this into a public park, is technical. Many of these landfills contain waste. They're then wrapped with a liner, and then they have very, very shallow soils, and most of those soils are clay. They're not a very hospitable soil for a landscape to grow. Many of the grass seed that has been sown by the engineers over the years is a very aggressive grass. It's useful for stabilizing the slopes, but it's not very good for biodiversity or for public function. At the same time, as this landfill deteriorates over time, if you will, these mounds actually deflate. They actually get lower and lower over time, and they deflate in an often uneven format. They give off methane gas, and they give off a thing called leachate, which is if water runs through the landfill, the water itself is considered to be leachate. So it's an extremely interesting, technical, engineered landscape, but it poses a lot of technical challenges as to how we can actually make this now into a public landscape. Here you see some of the slopes being maintained by the Department of Sanitation. You get this extraordinary landscape of vast horizons, big topographic slopes, mown grass, and sometimes, the next slide, what I call rather ghostly or surreal situations. I'm originally from the north of England, which is a fairly bereft landscape in terms of hills and hollows and fogs and mists and very vast open hillsides. And Freshkills in many ways reminds me of that landscape. It's of huge scale, great sense of sky, but there's something very ghostly and extraordinary about it. So from a design point of view, one of the things we wanted to consider are the various layers that go into making this landscape. From the engineering layers, the drainage layers, the leachate layers, the methane layers, the cover, various soil cover layers, and also the new layers that we want to begin to build over time. The new soils, new plantings, new pathways, new fields, new play areas, and new types of amenity. The problem is this diagram is a bit abstract, but it's actually a plan of the site in 3 stages. And it's a little bit of a diagram to communicate the idea of growth. That perhaps instead of designing a wonderful master plan that is unlikely to be built in all of its perfection, maybe we should design a process around which this very large and complex landscape could begin to grow over time. Beginning with small investment, small seed projects that begin to colonize and spread and begin to occupy the site over time. This is a diagram from forestry management techniques when foresters are trying to build a complex forest of multi-aged trees. At the beginning, they'll plant a series of small fields, and every year they'll go in and through management will begin to produce a much more complex, multi-aged, stratified woodland system. It's the same idea at Freshkills. We're not going to do what we did on the High Line, which is design something with exquisite detail and plant it in one season and have it grow. But rather we actually have to take a long time to begin to grow a much more industrially scaled or agriculturally scaled landscape. It's a little bit like the way lichens or algae behave as pioneer species in the landscape, beginning to add complexity over time and beginning to produce a more complex mosaic of woodlands and meadows and wetlands over time. This is a bit of a technical drawing, but it shows the idea of designing a process where we're designing what will happen in the first few years and what will happen in the next few years, etc., etc. Now, to communicate this to the community as well as to politicians and investors, you know, their expectation is always, well, you know, what am I going to get at the end of the day? And one of the efforts we've tried to make over the past few years is to communicate that if Freshkills is to be a living and dynamic and changing and growing landscape, in a sense it never has a finished state. It's not going to be like Versailles. I don't think it will ever be like Central Park. It's a different phenomenon. It's something that is always going to be changing. So we had an idea to try to communicate what Freshkills might be like in the first few years. And we had an idea that in order to build new soils and in order to create new meadows and new plantings, it would need to take on the characteristics of an agricultural landscape. It would need to be a landscape in transformation. We had an idea that instead of importing new soils from the region at considerable expense, we could actually grow crops that would be of a high organic quotient and mow or plow these crops into the soil every 6 months. And it's been demonstrated that after 5 years of this process, you could actually create 6 to 9 inches of a highly organic topsoil. So the process of building soil in situ and having an early stage landscape expression that is agricultural and industrial in its character. There was an idea to, this is called an imprint, the next slide is called an imprinting machine. This is a roller that rolls up and down the slopes of the landfill, and it actually creates little divots, and those divots are where we can establish new plantings, so that when it rains and storms, there isn't runoff off the slope, but there's actually a series of places where seedlings can begin to take root. This is the machine, creates a sort of divoted landscape. We worked with the local native plant center to establish a native meadow mix that would use seeds native to this area of Staten Island and begin to help us establish a much more biodiverse, ecologically robust, and sustainable meadow on these new soil landscapes. We designed a little packet and distributed these packets throughout the community as part of a process of communication. More recently, a herd of goats has come onto the Freshkills site. These guys eat a grass that's very invasive on Freshkills. It's called Phragmites grass, and it's extremely invasive. It's hard to get rid of. Well, these goats will eat all the Phragmites. And so, this idea of an agricultural landscape, a landscape using agricultural techniques of transformation, is already taking place with these herds of goats. And they're sort of fascinating. I think Eloise might talk about educational programs and getting people out to Freshkills to learn about it. There's something interesting about seeing the goats and learning what they're doing. There are also early restoration projects beginning to just restore some of the tidal flats and the tidal creeks, and beginning to bring more biodiversity and more life into this park. When we first conceived the park, we called it Lifescape, in an effort to get around the picturesque or the pictorial idea of landscape, the Central Park idea of a park as a landscape, and instead to communicate the idea of a lifescape, a place that is about life and the dynamics of growth and evolution and development and change and process over time, and the enrichment of this otherwise ecologically fairly bereft place into a much more biodiverse and much more complex set of ecologies. In addition to the soils and the plantings and the meadow seeds and the goats and the re-establishment of small ecosystems, we proposed a series of art projects, and Eloise again might speak to this because one of the projects that was very successful was a competition a couple of years ago called the Land Generator, which was about how artists could begin to engage with Freshkills. We had an idea early on of floating balloons simply to communicate to a very skeptical community that in actual fact change was happening, and it was a positive and constructive change. We had a proposal to move one of the old blue trash diggers to the side of the expressway and hang a huge billboard that was advertising the transformation and communicating to people what was happening at the park and beginning to arouse curiosity and interest in the level of transformation. We had new signage programs, and Eloise and her team in recent years have begun to open the park up for guided tours, for educational visits, for kayaking in some of the creeks, for walking and hiking and exploring the different parts of the park, or for cycling on certain occasions. We've also designed and opened a small playground that begins to allow the community to come into the park and see parts of the park from this location. And from that park, a small pathway that takes you into the edge of the park. And if you are lucky enough to go for what's called a sneak peek or an educational visit to the park today, from the top of the mounds, this is the kind of view you'll get. Extraordinary views all the way around, and from the top of this mound you'll see Lower Manhattan in the distance with part of the Staten Island Greenbelt in the middle ground. So those we saw as being the early days, and that we're still in those early days, these early days of ecological development, ecological enrichment, the establishment of soils, the establishment of restoration landscapes, the inclusion of arts and culture, and just the beginnings of getting people in to begin to look at the place. As time goes by, we would want to see more investment in pathways and bridges and connections that bring people into the park. It's so vast that it lends itself to what we call big nature experiences. whether it's mountain biking or hiking or horseback riding or camping. These are all possible within a landscape this big. There are a series of soccer fields already being installed on one side of the park for sports and activities. One day there will need to be a drive through the park, which is important to begin to bring people in and to have them have access to the park. There's an idea to reinvigorate some of the old barges in the waterways that used to bring trash to Freshkills, and have a series of new floating gardens that would be a sort of a destination. People would say, have you seen the floating gardens at Freshkills? These would be extraordinary experiences floating on the water, as well as rearranging some of the old diggers, which are one of the most curious artifacts today, just by virtue of the scale of these things, and beginning to open them up for public experience. One project that's already being drawn up and developed for construction is this pathway. It's called a part of North Park. It's designed as a sort of earthwork, as a pure arc, using an engineered geometry in order to intensify, if you will, the engineered and the made character of Freshkills. And it's an arc that allows you to rise up and then to fall down as you come into the park. It's about a half a mile long, and the whole idea is to create a strong sense of topographic arrival at the park. Initially, you would park your car, you would get on your bike, or you begin to walk into the park. There's a solar-powered canopy that's part of an energy program that we foresee at the park. And as you get deeper into the park, there are opportunities for cycling and strolling and sitting. And as you get deeper into the park, you begin to feel it getting greener. You go into the woods, you go into the meadows, and as you descend that arc and come out of the meadows, you come into the wetland area with a bird viewing tower. We believe this is quite important to be able to get you up to a higher elevation to begin to see the landscape around. And over time, in the next phase, we call this placescape. And this is really when the landfill operations have begun to really slow down and transition, and we're able to build more substantial areas of park. This is a proposal for one of those parks on one of the creeks, envisioning large new lawns for festivals and markets and events and flying kites, a place to get down to the water and put a kayak in the creeks, larger types of public landscape for more programming and more cultural amenity in certain locations. And this was a proposal. This is the mound. This mound, by the way, is nearly a mile long. The two rectangles you see there are the same shape and size of the two twin towers. This was the mound that a lot of the debris from the 9/11 event were brought by barge, and then they were sorted on top of this mound. And there's an extraordinary story about the recovery effort and the story behind what happened on this mound. And one of the things we were exploring here was the idea of a large earthwork that you would have to walk up, and it would take you 20 minutes to walk up one and then up the other. And that duration of being in this empty, vast horizontal landscape, that 20-minute duration would create sufficient reflection on the sheer scale and magnitude of what these two towers once were. And when you do get to the top, of the final mound, this would be your view on axis, geometrically perfectly on axis with Lower Manhattan and the original site of the trade towers. And then, after maybe 20 or 30 years, we've begun to create a much more robust park with drives and pathways, restored landscapes, meadows, woodlands, wetlands, tidal flats, a much more biodiverse and healthy and ecologically diverse place, an extraordinarily large-scale landscape in a dense metropolitan area for cycling, jogging, hiking, touring, getting down to the creeks, and enjoying this vast scale of landscape and sky and horizon, and looking out from all of these different hilltops at the city around. I think it was the New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman who said that, perhaps one of the best things to happen to Staten Island, if not to the metropolitan region, was the fact that this was a landfill for so long, because it actually has led to the conservation of over 4 square miles of undeveloped, contiguous landscape, which is a wonderful opportunity now to have that kind of open space in the city. So this is my last slide, and it's really just to make the point that whereas the High Line was built in a relatively short amount of time, and the sort of, as a designer, the amount of attention you pay to detail and to craft and to execution, it's the design of a place. Freshkills is much more about the design of a method, or the design of a process, the design of an evolving system. And that's its story, that's its richness, that perhaps over our lifetimes we can experience this place in a range of different conditions and a range of different events. But at the same time, I've always resisted the notion that Freshkills be somehow beautified or made into a park like every other park, because there is something extraordinary about the place today, and that somehow it would be nice if we could retain that ghostly and that strange and that odd quality that characterizes the landscape today. That does it for me. I'd like to introduce Eloise Hirsh to say a few words.
Well, the work of Jim and his firm and the very incredibly talented designers in his firm really gave the staff that has been working on Freshkills Park and the development of it really a vision that we are all very focused on and working toward. Jim used the words, take a really long time. This is something that will take possibly eons to transform. In fact, what I want to do today is, it is true, it will take a really long time, but there's a lot of stuff going on right now. And that's what's going to be actually the focus of my talk. Jim and I actually did not collaborate on, we actually didn't get a chance to talk to each other, so you're probably going to see some of the same slides, but in maybe a little bit of a different context. This is the image that a lot of people do have in their minds of Freshkills Park, but in fact, this is what it looks like today. So this is what the place actually looks like, and in fact, it is the most elegant testimony to the strength of nature that you can possibly imagine. As I said, Jim's work, the work of his firm, really gave us an extraordinary vision of where we might be. It is, like the High Line, it is a park of the 21st century. It is the largest landfill to park transformation in the world. Nobody else is doing anything this big. For this huge project, there's a little tiny staff that has as its mission these four things essentially, particularly to deliver a message about demonstrating what it takes really to restore very, very damaged landscapes. The landfill history, you may or may not know that it was Robert Moses that decided to fill the wetlands on western Staten Island. People had a very different understanding of the use of wetlands in the beginning of the last century. And so it was at one time all of the 3,000 acres around Freshkills Creek was a clay bottom, as Jim said, and a light manufacturing area, but people thought that wetlands should be filled in, and they were pestilential. So from 1948 to 2001, all of New York City's garbage gradually ended up in this place. 150 million tons of garbage is at this site. If you lived in New York City from 1948 to 2001, you helped build what is now a really very beautiful place. But actually, only 45% of the site itself is landfill, and the rest is creeks and woodlands and dry lowlands. There's this iconic image of the last barge of Staten Island in 2001. That last barge happened because there was a political moment in time. As you all may know, Staten Island is the only reliably Republican borough in the city of New York, and there was a moment in time where there was a Republican governor and a Republican mayor and Staten Island's elected Republican officials. And it was only that moment in time that allowed what had been screams from the community for decades to close it, but it was only that moment in time that allowed the closure to happen. And when it did happen, I'll just quickly zoom across this. You know where the region is, and these are sort of like-minded regional big parks. Same slide. We all use this slide all the time. And I've developed this. I can put this slide over Pittsburgh and Boston and San Francisco. It dwarfs actually San Francisco. But the key thing about this site is, as Jim mentioned, the fact that it was a landfill means that it is a totally engineered landscape. Landfills make two products. They make landfill gas, half of which is methane, and they make leachate. As Jim said, leachate is liquid that percolates through decomposing trash. The best analogy is if you don't change your kitchen garbage can, that brown stuff that is at the bottom of your garbage can in your kitchen, that's leachate. About 150 million tons of leachate makes for a lot of leachate, and so there are three different kinds of systems that manage the products of the landfill. The methane processing system, the leachate management system, and stormwater management system. This is what makes up a landfill cap. The reason I actually spend some time talking about this is a lot of times people say, is it really safe? Can I let my kids play there? And in fact, it is incredibly well engineered to be safe. The way you make a landfill is you put in trash, then fill, trash, fill, until mounds get to be the height that engineers have decided they should do. Then there's a soil layer that gives the final shape. And then there's an impermeable plastic liner. It's about this thick. It'll last hundreds of years. That seals the garbage. Then on top of that, I forgot to say, there's a gas ventilation layer. There are throughout the site landfill gas header pipes that are sucking landfill gas from that decomposing trash. It's a vacuum system that is linked to a processing plant. So that's all sealed underneath. There's a drainage layer that allows water to go off, to sheet off quite quickly. Then on top of that, there's 2.5 feet of incredibly clean soil. And these are just, again, some pictures of this stuff being laid down. In addition to the systems that are managing what's underneath, there are also systems managing the stormwater runoff. This is a huge downshoot that takes care of, and it's an example of what's being built today, that takes care of the stormwater coming off the mountain, because you really don't want water pooling and putting excess pressure on all of the pipes that are underneath the ground. This is what the landfill header pipes look like right now. But actually, our geotechnical engineers have figured out a way to manhole them, which means that they are at grade and we don't have to worry about them. This is the gas processing plant. The city has a contract with National Grid, which is all of our gas company. And right now, National Grid takes the gas that Freshkills generates, heats the equivalent of 22,000 homes, and this site is right now basically a renewable energy resource. These are pictures of the leachate walls and the processing plant for the leachate. But that engineering essentially defines what we can and can't do on the site. Jim's firm won an international competition in 2000, as he said. It was a competition that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Municipal Art Society, but the Municipal Art Society said to Rudy Giuliani as Freshkills was closing, you know, this is the last time the city's going to get this much land. You should not blow the opportunity. And so there was an international competition. Firms from all over the world competed, and thank goodness James Cornerfield Operations won that competition. There was a 3-year planning process, hundreds and hundreds of sessions all over Staten Island and around Manhattan. Thousands of people participated, and that process yielded the master plan, the draft master plan that we work to this day. And what that master plan did was give us some of the basic plans for the capital projects that are now underway. The way we thought about our capital projects, we had an initial budget of $200 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but actually for a site this big really isn't. But it's enough to get started. And so the way we thought about it was, let's do projects that sit right next to the neighborhoods, so that the people that have had to deal with this for the longest period of time get the first fruits of it. And then let's figure out a way to get people out to the waterways and on top of the mounds so they can see the views. So our first project was a Schmuel Park restoration, which is what Jim just talked about. This is what it was before his firm got their hands on it. A very typical Parks Department asphalt and chain link playground, and it is today someplace that says, and this is very important, says that something new is happening here, something important is happening here, and we are entering the park through this new place. At the same time, we created a series of soccer fields in the southern end of the neighborhoods. And of course, everybody loves soccer fields, but also the Comfort Station. Comfort Station, of course, is New Yorkese for bathrooms. This building is LEED Platinum certified, green roofed, geothermal heated, wind powered. Everything that we build on this site is going to express sustainability in some fashion. This project is the fields are also complete, and the Comfort Station is under construction. North Park was the project that Jim talked about, and you can see its relation to Schmuel Park, the neighborhood entrance. This is what it looks like today. And this is what the pathway, that will be the path that he described. These are real photos. Obviously, these people are photoshopped in, but they're superimposed on real pictures of the site. So this actually is what it's going to look like. This is fully funded. It's in permitting. We hope to bid it by the end of this year. It'll have founder seed farm and a tree nursery, actually, so that the first time that the public is freely on the site, they'll be walking through a site that is already healing itself. And we did do this Main Creek wetland restoration with our goats. And the reason we did it The reason we did it was twofold, really. One was it's a much more sustainable way to go in and get rid of that invasive vegetation. But the other reason we did it was that we wanted to start to introduce the idea, particularly to our regulators, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, I introduced the idea that we're probably going to need some four-legged help to mow these 2,200 acres, and so there is husbandry in this park's future. So that Main Creek wetland restoration is complete. It was funded and it's finished now. The next project that is underway is a new Springville Greenway. This is a 3.5-mile greenway that is an off-road facility that is a $10 million project funded by the federal government that connects two on-road facilities. And Staten Island, as you might imagine, it's the most car-dependent borough of the city of New York, and you do take your life in your hands. Well, you take your life in your hands anywhere, but on Staten Island, it's a tough place to ride a bike. But this is going to be what is now, this is the eastern edge of Freshkills Park, and this is Staten Island's major retail corridor where all the big box, this is where the Staten Island Mall is, all the big box retailers, and this desert next to what is essentially an 8-lane highway is going to become basically an off-road facility for bikes and pedestrians, and also a great entrance for people coming into Freshkills Park. Then building on the south, the south side of building on the southern project is what we call South Park, which is a naming opportunity for something else. This again is a project that James Corner Field Operations firm has done, and it's envisioned as a much more active site with biking and skating, and it'll have ball fields, it'll have winter sports, and actually it will have, this again is a real picture of the site, and this is what we're going to use as a naturally occurring amphitheater, and this is what it will look like. This park is fully designed. Unfortunately, we lost the construction funding in a budget crunch 2 years ago, but it will come back because it's a project that actually is ready to go. Now, the North Park projects and the South Park projects, as you see, they're kind of skinny. And the reason they're skinny is that the Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State regulation, says that wherever the public is going to step on this landfill has to be residential grade soil. So when North and South mounds were closed, they were closed with soil which was not certified as residential. So we are having to bring, in an unsustainable way, we are having to bring in new clean soil, which is very expensive. So those projects are very thin. They just are trying to get people into the landscape. East Park, which is our next focus, the East Park project was begun after the capping and closing of that mound was begun after we began working with the Department of Sanitation. And I should pause actually and say that the Department of Sanitation is our partner in this, because as we're working to make a park on the top, Department of Sanitation continues to maintain and monitor all that infrastructure underneath. And they laid down, when we began working together, they laid down residential grade soil. So our plans for this, actually, we don't have a very big budget. We just want to bring the public onto it. We want to bring the public onto, let them walk around these moors, essentially. Let the public in to really see what the potential is for this beautiful place. It does have certain design challenges. Right now, this is something that says to 8-year-old boys, you must come in here. And so we have to figure out a way to protect the public from some pretty attractive nuisances. But the potential for what's essentially a great wilderness on the inside and the mall on the other side of the street for really being able to get people excited about the potential of this place. We're very excited about the development of East Park. But our capital program will take a really long time. So we've spent time thinking about how can we animate the site? How can we make this site start to live actually in civic conversation as something other than, oh yeah, that's the thing that'll happen in 30 years. So one way is to use it as a research site, because it has so much to tell us about what you do with land that has been compromised in some way. Every city in the country, most in the world, have landfills. People come from all over the world and all over the country to ask us, what are we doing? What are the possibilities? What does it take to do something like this? Right now, we've got a couple of random research projects going on. We're working with an ornithologist from Hunter, a biologist from College of Staten Island who's studying turtles, another biologist who's doing a bat study. I have to get a bat slide. I don't have a bat slide yet. But these guys are all harbingers of environmental health, and they tell us something about the increasing health and the increasing biodiversity of the site. There are renewable energy projects at a small scale. Each of our facilities will be powered by some kind of renewable energy, and also the city has issued an RFP for developing solar and wind at Freshkills, and that may well come to be in the next couple of years. Art plays a major role, we think. I mean, there's a potential here for this. This is certainly a potentially Storm King on the Arthur Kill. I mean, it's vast landscapes. But we right now have a Percent for Art project that'll happen. We've been part of citywide projects with Creative Time. We've done dance performances on top of the mound. When I came into a sanitation chief's office and said, we want to actually bring some modern dancers out here and have a performance. And his eyes rolled heavenward, but he said, just so long as the infrastructure doesn't get damaged. So that really is we're just trying all different kinds of things. We've got a visitor center made out of an old construction trailer, robust web presence, crowdsourced applications. We actually have, and this is thanks to the academic community, I think Freshkills has a higher profile internationally than it does in the city of New York. We've been in publications, Jim's written books, we've been all sorts of notoriety and interest. So our other major push is to bring people onto the site in whatever way we can. Right now, it's a closed site, so what that means is whenever the public comes to the site, someone from my team has to be there in some way. So we have a pretty robust tour program. Every week we give tours on Wednesdays and Saturdays. We have birding tours, kayaking tours, events and performances. We will go anywhere, anytime to talk to anybody about it. And if any of you are from a group that would like this kind of a talk, I'm glad to come there. We do school presentations because part of our mission is to ask people to think about not just this pretty landscape, but also what's their responsibility about waste, what's everybody's personal involvement in issues of renewal and recycling. We also have begun to do larger events. On the 10th anniversary of the closure of Freshkills, to sort of mimic that barge, that iconic last barge of trash, we brought in a barge of trees. But the best thing that we're doing, I think, is and this is being our 4th year, is we are opening about 300 acres of the park to the public for a day in the fall. And you guys are in luck because it's this Sunday. And I'm hoping, actually, that people picked up this card at the entrance booth. And we open the park for all day from 11 to 4. You can kayak, you can ride bikes, you can fly kites, build bird boxes, but really you can see the future, what the future will be just for a day. So what I'm hoping is that you'll take us up on the invitation. This is our team. And directions to sneak peek are on this card and on our website. Thanks very much.
I'm looking at how you are planning right now to include cars going through the park. And I'm wondering if that is short-sighted. Those of us that live near Central Park have been kind of fighting for the last 30 years to get the cars out of the park, and clearly this is 4 times the size. However, I'm wondering if you've thought about light rail or trolleys or anything that keeps individual cars. Even though you're in Staten Island, there are going to be tons of people from the other boroughs who are going to want to bike all the way out there or drive out there or take buses out there with their bikes and then be able to ride. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about alternatives to having individual cars in the park.
Well, we certainly are hoping to have ferry transportation. There is a plan in Staten Island for a West Shore light rail, and there will be bus transportation. But it would be incredibly short-sighted not to have a road through the park, because there will be a road built likely long before the park itself is fully built out. And one of the things that I'm anxious to have happen is for people to drive through it and see it, and to say, oh wow, I can hardly wait for this place to be developed. There will, when you say, albeit it is Staten Island, that is not an inconsequential sentence. People, it's 2,200 acres as opposed to 864. And people will need cars to get there. We're closer to New Jersey than we are to Queens. We're closer to Newark than we are to Queens. And cars will be a reality, but the 2,200 acres gives us the opportunity, and the master plan gives us the opportunity to plan for many trails and many opportunities. I mean, as you can see, the first transportation project actually is a bikeway.
This is a question for James. You mentioned the different parts of the park are going to sink at different speeds as the waste under them compacts. Can you talk a little bit more about how that knowledge informed the design process?
Well, I mean, as the trash sort of decomposes, it sinks. And one of the landfill engineers' requirements is that there's never any pooling of water on the landfill. So you have these very, very large plateaus, but they're very gently crowned to be able to shed water. But because of this settlement that's always happening, the engineers are obliged to continually fill these depressions and begin to, maintain the plateau. So, that to me is just symptomatic of a landscape that's fascinating because it's living, it's dynamic, it's changing. It's very different from designing the big lawn at Central Park as something that's relatively permanent and just gets mown every week in the summer. This is a landscape that's much more dynamic, and so I think what Eloise and I have been trying to communicate for years to a lot of different people is to begin to change your expectation about what you think a public landscape is. That if Freshkills, the very nature of Freshkills is that it's living, it's dynamic, it's evolving, it's changing, it's going to be different from year to year to year because different things are growing and different things are happening. That sense of a dynamic living landscape is something that I think is very important. And the deflating landfill is just one part of that story of an always emerging ecosystem.
Hi. The work you're doing is amazing. I just question about how you handle lighting. there's a bike path that goes all the way up to the bridge over here, as everybody knows. And I read about an article where a couple of kids pulled out like a clothesline, and they caught this biker, and then they mugged him. So, which is terrible, for the psyche of a bicyclist, knowing they're going down this path. But you also don't want to do all these bright lights, because it kind of takes away from the mystical, beautiful, you're going through all these things. So as a designer, that's probably a really tough challenge. I was just curious if you guys had a chance to think about it, how are you going to light it?
Well, again, I mean, we, as a public landscape, we're obliged to do our utmost for health and safety. So everything has to be built to code and has to meet regulatory standards, including bike paths and this sort of thing. With regards to lighting, I think part of our philosophy is that, because this is a place of nature, I mean, there are the bats and the birds and the aquatic life. It should be dark at nighttime, and it should probably close as a park, just like Central Park closes. And it's not open and brightly lit, but it is a place that goes into darkness. And I think that's necessary for New York City parks in general, but I think there's also a wonderful poetic as well as practical purpose for that at Freshkills.
So, two questions. You're talking about nature over the long term. I'm curious if you think there are going to be any big animals that are going to inhabit Freshkills beyond deer and such. And then,
Well, we do have, right now we have a herd of deer, of course. We have coyotes, we have foxes. How big do you mean?
that's big enough.
Because actually somebody from the Staten Island Zoo came out one day and said, "Oh, wow, I'd love a piece of this for the panther exhibit."
And then the second question is, you've, I think, discussed the fact that it's going to cost a lot of money to develop Freshkills. And also, at the same time, you're doing a different model than other parks in the city. Other parks in the city have used these public-private partnerships. Is that something that's sort of possible technically or desirable?
I can't thank you enough for bringing that up, because in fact, there is a Freshkills Park Alliance. It is nascent, just beginning. Because it's just beginning, it's desperate for money. And in fact, we're just building a website, which should be live, I hope, in another month or two. But what private money funds and what public money funds is an interesting question in this landscape. This project is, from my point of view, I'm just speaking for myself right now, this project is too big for private money to be part of the capital construction. It's too much. But where private money would be really appropriate is for all the kinds of programs that we would like to do, for all the kinds of, once we have landscape that has begun, to measures that would sustain it, help with maintaining it, education programs and access programs. But probably this is a big public, it's also a big public obligation. And so, but I think there is definitely a role for private partnership, and the Freshkills Park Alliance is it.
There's so many questions here, which is fabulous, but I want to be cognizant of people's times, including the presenters' times. So I think we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, thank you. I would like to know what percentage of the park is going to be for wildlife and what for, human recreation, because we have plans for the gateway that are taking place that are taking over more and more land that was used by wildlife and turning it into recreational facilities and concrete and buildings and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm concerned about, because there is a lot of wildlife there.
This is another example of how terrific it was that this place was a landfill, because you really can't build there's almost no place on this site where you can build major recreational facilities. We had to look very long and hard to find enough flat, dry space to locate 2 ball fields in the southern section of the park. You can't, there will be recreation facilities in terms of trails for hiking and biking, but these expanses of natural grassland are an incredible resource in this region, and they're going to stay natural grassland.
So congratulations and thank you. You said this is the largest landfill to park program in the world, and I'm wondering where you got your inspiration from or ideas, what other projects exist in the world, and how are you building on those?
I mean, from my point of view, I don't think there was an original source of inspiration, apart from the fact of the natural landscape itself, that, it sort of became really obvious that you could not design Central Park here, that there isn't the money, it's not that kind of topography, it's not that kind of urban context with the surrounding development in relationship to the park. It was pretty clear we couldn't do Versailles, so any kind of traditional landscape architectural trope, whether it's the pastoral trope or the axial formal trope, neither of them worked here. So we sort of had to invent a different approach, and that approach had to do with ecology, with biological systems, with recognizing what the processes are here in this place, and how to design a methodology around which these processes could be steered and guided to create an evolving shape, an evolving landscape. And again, it's a difficult thing for people to get their heads around, because when you talk about a project, you like to think that there's a beginning and an end to the project, and there's a definition to what that end is. But I really do believe that Freshkills is an evolving project. And so therefore, it's a challenge to design as to how you design in that sort of medium.
And my daily inspiration actually comes from getting to be part of the transformation. The fact that we are taking what was the world's largest landfill and making it into an extraordinary public asset. That's kind of it for me.
Have a great night, all of you. Stay warm.